Welcome to the community of Belmont. My name is David Roland and I'm presenting for the Ruth Faulkner Library's Person of Interest series. The title of my talk today is The Twists and Turns of Life and the Surprising Opportunities They Present. I was 16 years old when I went downstairs to my mother's study in our home and started to check out her books. She was a medical person, so she had lots of textbooks, but then I found this particular book, What Freud Really Said by David Stafford Clark. It was a summary of the great works by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a neurologist in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He lived in Vienna and he came up with these amazing theories about human behavior, the unconscious, neuroses, repression, interpretation of dreams, sexual drives, and he helped to explain why people did what they did. I just thought, wow, here is a window into the human soul, into the way humans behave. And from then on I was hooked. I really wanted to understand why people did what they did. So by the time I'd finished high school, I'd read most of Sigmund Freud's major works, and I went on to the University of Sydney and became a psychologist. And I remember those years of smug confidence, looking out the window of the library at the university, or being on the train leaving the railway platform on my way to or from the university, and just looking at people passing by and thinking, I know why you behave the way you behave. I was incredibly confident in my total ignorance. And that was true until I went to Grafton Jail, my first psychology position. I got my naivety knocked out of me quick smart, because Grafton Jail was an old style jail in the country in far northern New South Wales. It's one of those jails that's built like a castle made out of sandstone, big sandstone bricks and a big massive wooden door at the front. And in that particular jail were held remand prisoners, those people that had been arrested, were awaiting trial to determine their guilt or innocence. And also it particularly specialised in a lot of life sentence prisoners, particularly murderers who'd done series of crimes that meant that they were going to see out their days for the rest of their life in prison. And there were 4 groups of people that I met there for the very first time. I was from a very comfortable middle-class background, and I met murderers for the first time. And I remember one of these murderers was an arts photographer. He did a lot of fashion photography, and at that time he seemed pretty ancient to me. He was probably in his 50s by that stage, and I was in my early 20s. One day he invited 3 of his fashion models to go on a Sunday picnic with him, and they went along. He drove the car. And I don't know whether they had lunch before or after this, but he tied them up to a tree and over the course of the day raped them. When he was finished, he untied them, drove them home, dropped them off, and just said goodbye as if it was just a normal day. Well, of course, the next day he was arrested and sent to jail. Now, he served his time and then came out eventually and re-entered the fashion world and became trusted once again. But this time he did much the same thing. On this occasion, he almost tried to murder a woman. So he was sent to prison for life. And then one time in the prison, there was a variety concert and he tried to kill the social worker. So this was a guy who looked benign and innocent as I sat with him in his cell, because I had to get to know all the life sentence prisoners. But here I thought, he's a true psychopath. I'd met my first psychopath. And I remember speaking with him and feeling like, I can't touch you. There's something about you that's unreachable, and I cannot understand why you did what you did. The other groups of people were paedophiles. I remember one paedophile who had befriended, or what we would call now groomed, a young boy, and would take him out bush, and they'd learn bush skills. Lots of things, obviously, that the boy enjoyed doing. And then he did his sexual acts, whatever they were. What struck me about him was that he saw absolutely nothing wrong with what he'd done. He couldn't see why society wouldn't think well of him because he'd shown this boy lots of useful things, he'd befriended him. And that really struck me, that people can be really on this path and never show any remorse simply because they don't understand that others disapprove of what they've done. The other group that I met were rapists, and they were really hard to get to like. But the third group was the drug addicts. And at that time, in the early 1980s, heroin was the main drug of choice, and it was starting to become in epidemic proportions. And it was in those early days that it was said that drugs were starting to infiltrate the prisons, so even if you were in prison, you could still use. And I really took to the drug addicts and alcoholics because a lot of them came from homes that you might think were stable. For one reason or another, they'd gone off the rails and used drugs and alcohol as a form of coping. And so I set up a weekly drug group, which was totally voluntary, and these guys would come along. And I really enjoyed getting to know them and understanding what the motivations were behind drug addiction. Well, twists and turns happen, and because I was now a bit of an expert around drug addiction in the prison system, I was invited to be a psychologist running the therapy program at a new massive prison in Sydney called Parklea. Parklea was a new jail in Western Sydney, a massive, massive jail with huge fences with razor wire that went around it. It was high security, and in those days, some very high-profile inmates were incarcerated there, including the Bandito motorcycle gang who committed murders at the Milpera massacre. I didn't have much to do with them because they kept to themselves. But I was invited to run the therapy program in a new unit that we just called the drug unit. It was really for inmates who had addiction problems, mainly heroin and alcohol. And this was held within the protection unit, which was in the main body of the jail. So it was a jail within a jail. And in the protection unit were inmates who wouldn't survive if they went into the main part of the prison. So these were paedophiles, who were colloquially known as rock spiders, some of the rapists, people that for one reason or another would be very vulnerable. So the drug unit was on the top story of this protection unit, and I would go in every morning, run the drug therapy program, do some individual counselling and so on. And I really enjoyed that work. It was in February 1986 that one of the most high-profile murder cases occurred. And this was the murder of the nurse, Anita Kabhi. Anita would have been about the same age as me, in the mid-20s at that point. And she worked at the old Sydney Hospital in the city of Sydney. She was travelling home late one Sunday evening. Normally she wouldn't stay back after work. She'd catch the train to Blacktown Station in Western Sydney. Her father would pick her up from the station and take her home. But on this particular occasion, she stayed back to have dinner and some drinks with mates before she left. She caught the train home, and then she got to Blacktown Station Sunday evening and then went to the phone box. This is the pre-mobile phone days. And those of you who are old enough to remember this, remember that a lot of those telephone boxes didn't work when they needed to work. And on this occasion, it didn't work. So she decided to walk home, and she's walking through the darkened streets of Blacktown from the station when a group of guys driving a car, 5 young men, pulled up beside her, dragged her into the car and abducted her. Well, she spent a horrific night. They took her to a cow paddock, and by the morning she was dead. The investigating police in this particular murder are still left with the marks from that investigation and seeing what state she was in. She fought to the last breath for her life. Now, I was in the protection unit when 3 of the 5 killers were brought into the prison. And so I would see them every day when I went up to the drug unit to run the therapy program. And their stares were cold, and they left me feeling cold. but one of them asked for some counselling. He was actually very afraid for himself. They were all very afraid because they were getting a lot of death threats. And this particular one was afraid for his family outside the prison. The families were getting death threats as well. This was a very high-profile case. People were calling for the reinstitution of the death penalty, and whenever these guys were taken to the court, there were crowds yelling and screaming. When I sat with this one particular killer, it was the most difficult professional thing I think I've ever done, because I felt such immense disgust with what I was hearing about what they had done. But at the same time, as a professional, I felt obliged to do what I could to help him. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of my slide into what would become post-traumatic stress disorder many years later. I used to see the older psychologists in the prison, not where I was, but in other prisons, and I noticed how emotionally cut off they were. And I thought, I think it's time for me to leave the prison system, because I don't want to be emotionally cut off like that. And I was starting to get that jail mentality where I wasn't trusting people when I first met them. So I decided I would go and do some more study and take up study in clinical psychology, a postgraduate degree. But I really wanted to do a PhD in clinical psychology. But when I spoke to other PhD candidates or lecturers, they said, if you want to do a PhD, the two things you really need is passion for the subject and perseverance, because it's a really long slog. I enrolled in the clinical master's program at the University of Wollongong, which is on the coast south of Sydney. And I was on the postgraduate representative committee for the psychology department one day when the head of department said, the Conservatorium of Music, that was the local conservatorium, have come to us and said, our students are getting very anxious performing on stage. Do you think you could teach them relaxation skills or something like that? That's it, I thought. That's my PhD project. I could combine my passion as a psychologist and understanding and helping people with my own personal experience of being a musician. I was 12 or 13 when I first picked up a guitar, and also had a natural singing voice. And one day I went to a local folk club in Sydney where I was living and watched a band called the Rybuck Bush Band perform. They were a semi-professional band. I really liked the music, but I noticed they didn't have a singer or a guitarist. So afterwards I spoke to them and said, hey, do you want a singer and guitarist? I can do that. So they invited me along to the next rehearsal, and I joined them. So for quite a few years we played all around Sydney, mainly dance halls, but we also did some variety concerts, performed at the Sydney Opera House, and I really loved that music and loved performing for dancers and singing. So when this opportunity came along to help Conservatorium of Music students with relaxation, I thought, that's my passion. Now I've got the perseverance to see through a PhD. So I embarked on this research of how to help performers with stage fright. And that then led me to doing some remarkable interviews with really famous musicians. Some of these were Australian, others were those touring for the Australian Broadcasting Commission from overseas. And I sometimes didn't quite realise what the lifestyle was like for some of these international performers. I remember meeting a Russian pianist, concert pianist, who was playing at the Opera House, and sitting with him in his hotel room, and just as a way of small chit-chat said, oh, how's the weather back home? And he said, oh, I don't know, I haven't been there for 3 months. And I also met some fantastic American jazz musicians. So it was a great project. And then while I was 2/3 way through my research, I got the opportunity to apply as a counsellor for the Canberra School of Music and Canberra School of Art. And in those days, they were really high-profile institutions. And so I worked there with music students and art students, and finished my last study for the research and developed a really effective program for how to help performers with their mental skills in preparation for a performance and then on stage. And also had the help then, because I was in Canberra, I had the access to the chief sports psychologist at the Institute of Sport, because elite athletes were a bit ahead of the game with performers in developing mental skills and using mental imagery as a way to prepare for Olympics, for example. So I was a world expert on performance anxiety in musicians and singers, and I was invited to a major music education conference in South Korea where I presented. We moved back from Canberra to Sydney, and I set up my first private practice, which was a conventional clinical psychology practice, part forensic, part psychotherapy. But I kept a special part of the practice for working with performers, and I got some well-known performers come and see me to help with anxiety around performing. After a few years of doing this, I started to realize that I had worked with so many performers that it was time really to spread the word and maybe try writing a book. And in those days, I had no idea how the publishing industry worked, so I just rang up a few publishing houses, spoke to the commissioning editors, and finally I settled on a specialist performing arts publisher, because I really wanted to keep it for performers. And the result of that was this self-help book called The Confident Performer. And I wrote it in that self-help kind of way. It's very practical, simple language. And amazingly, it's being used around the world in teaching institutions, and as far as I know, is still used in the world. It's gone through a number of reprints, as published in the UK and America as well as Australia. Now, this book came from that little conversation when I was sitting on that student committee when the Conservatorium of Music had asked if we could teach performers relaxation skills. We left Sydney and moved to the far north coast of New South Wales. I set up a private practice once again, and it was about half forensic work and half psychotherapy work. The forensic work involved writing court reports for the criminal court where people had admitted their guilt and their solicitor thought maybe there were attenuating circumstances which would help explain to the judge or the magistrate the reasons why they'd done what they'd done, and also what help they may need. I also did victims' compensation assessments, but the work I most valued really in that period of time was working for the Children's Court Clinic. This is where children had been removed from their parents, perhaps due to neglect or abuse, or simply life circumstances where the parents couldn't adequately care for the children. And the court was wanting to make a decision about whether the children could be returned to the family, or maybe it was another relative, or a foster carer might need to be involved. So I would do family assessments, the children, the parents, extended family, and provide a very comprehensive report to the court. And magistrates said that our reports were like gold. They really informed in an impartial way what was going on for the child or the children. But after a few years, I noticed I was starting to get nightmares about my own children. I had three daughters at this point, and I would imagine them in some of the situations that I found the children I was assessing in, or even worse, my imagination was just running wild. And I started to think maybe I've become traumatized by all the work that I've done, especially the forensic work. And I went and saw a senior psychologist who I knew worked with trauma, and he diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and that did make a lot of sense. Now, this was in 2008 when I decided that I couldn't work anymore and would take some time off my practice. And it was in the middle of a global financial crisis, and we were in great financial stress because I couldn't work anymore. And in July 2009, I had a stroke out of the blue for no obvious medical reason. Because of my training that I'd had earlier in neuropsychology, and because in my practice in Sydney I'd done a lot of assessments of those with brain injury, and potentially they were looking to go on disability pensions, I had this inside experience, and there was no rehab plan for the type of stroke I had. I lost a quarter of my visual field, my auditory processing was affected, so having conversations like this, for example, was incredibly tiring and very difficult. I explained it as being like speaking English as a second language. So I devised my own rehab program, and that involved things like computer-based training, mindfulness meditation, which helped strengthen certain parts of the brain, but also learned that I needed to activate the left prefrontal cortex of the brain, and that's this part of the brain just behind our forehead here. That's the meaning-making part of the brain that likes to put things in sequence, make sense of life events. And this, if you like, the narrative part of the brain. Now, I had been journaling because I was getting such strong emotions and having experiences, and I would need to get things off my chest, and if I wrote them down, that helped give me some release. So over a number of years, I had these extensive journals documenting my experience, and after I got relatively well again, and I could think about other things other than just day-to-day survival and recovery, and maybe I've got a book in me about how I recovered, because I was aware I was doing some things that were reasonably innovative, and I could share that experience with others. So did I have a book? I went and saw Alan Close, who was a writing mentor at that time in my area, and he said, yes, I think you do. So to cut a long story short, our local Writers' Festival, the Byron Bay Writers' Festival, had a pitching session for aspiring authors to pitch in front of festival goers, but also publishers and agents, and just say what your idea was and see if there was any interest. Well, I pitched my idea. I was incredibly nervous, but straight after, a few of the publishers came and said, look, we would be interested in a manuscript if you could present us with a manuscript. And the next day, one of the publishers that hadn't spoken to me on the first day saw me walking by and said, hey, I saw you present, and look, I'd be interested in giving you a publication deal if you could write the first 3 chapters and a chapter synopsis. If I like it, that would be good enough for me. So, of course, I was very excited, and I needed to learn how to write in a narrative way rather than the professional way that I used to write my court reports. So that embarked me on a series of writing courses and exercises and mentoring. And what resulted was this book, How I Rescued My Brain, A Psychologist's Remarkable Recovery from Stroke and Trauma. This book ended up being a bit of a bestseller and was shortlisted with the Australian Book Industry Awards. And in 2015, I think it was, a reading body in the United Kingdom decided to make it a prescription book, which meant that doctors and other health professionals would prescribe this book amongst other books that were selected for particular conditions. So my hope that I could share my knowledge and my experience with others has been vindicated, not only from the sales, but also the readers' feedback that I've had, which showed that I have been able to do something really helpful and useful for a lot of people. Now, this part of the story is not in the book, How I Rescued My Brain, because it happened afterwards. When I was much better, I would test my limits every now and then, do something that I couldn't used to do and just see if I could do it now. And one of the things that I had to do was go to bed by 9 p.m. because I'd get so mentally fatigued otherwise. And also I couldn't be around crowds or lots of noise. The Woodford Folk Festival is a major festival in Queensland over the Christmas New Year period. And I hadn't been camping or been to a music festival for at least 5 years. And so I decided to test myself. I booked to go for 3 nights. I booked to go by myself, just in case I had to up and leave. And I managed to survive that 3 nights. So my brain would still work the next day, even if I'd stayed up late. The mental fatigue was catching up. But on the very last day I was there, which happened to be the last day of the festival, a friend suggested we go and listen to an Aboriginal reggae band. And we were dancing in the sand without our shoes, and they were a great band, and it was a really loose vibe, lovely atmosphere. And I hadn't really danced for many years, and although I could get the rhythm, I could get the beat, something really strange was happening. My head was telling my body to do moves, but my body was like, it was dislocated from my head. It was like something clunky and heavy. And I realized then, I had a major epiphany. I thought, in my rehab and recovery, I've been working on my head, but I've forgotten about my body. Now we know that trauma and distress and grief is encoded in our body. Our bodies remember that. Every cell potentially can hold a memory of a major life experience. And so that's when I realized I need to give my body some attention. Now a friend had suggested that I might go to a 5 rhythms class. Now the 5 rhythms class is a 2-hour session where it's just expressive dancing, and the idea is that your body moves you rather than your head moves the body. So you respond from your feet up to the beat of the music and just flow with the music in whatever way feels intuitive, and try and get that head out of it. And the 5 rhythms are flowing, staccato, chaos, lyrical, and stillness. And by the end of the 2 hours, you really do feel like you've just been washed through. But what I noticed was, as I responded to the music, it was as if there was this corkscrew of energy just flowing out of me. And I realized that this was all the trauma and the distress and the grief and whatever else was just unwinding out of me. And after several months of doing this, it really did feel like I was back in tune with my body, and my body was now free in a way that it hadn't been for many years. I also learnt around that time that one of the best brain health exercises is not only is it dancing, but also partner dancing. Now we know that a way of keeping the brain healthy and vital is to learn something new, like learning a new language. But the thing with dancing is that it incorporates so many different aspects, like movement, like the sound, like rhythm. Now partner dancing really adds on something else, because you're having to synchronize with someone else, so there's communication going on. And you also have to remember patterns, because you're not just doing expressive dance. Now a friend told me about some salsa teachers that live nearby, and I decided to go along because I was also wanting to hold a woman again. Unfortunately, by this time we'd divorced, my wife and I, because I think all those experiences in the past have been too much. But I'm happy to say we're good friends today, and our children are doing really well. So I wanted to hold a woman again and have touch, but non-sexual touch, safe touch. So I went along to these salsa classes, and in the first year, I think I got the rhythm, but nothing else. I couldn't remember anything else. My brain was still getting used to this idea of dancing in this synchronized way. The second year, I remembered some patterns, and then by the third year, I could actually go social dancing. I had the confidence to go social dancing at last. Now, as a treat to myself, last year, after completing the writing of my last book, I had booked to go on a dance tour of Cuba with my local dance teacher, because I'd really fallen in love with the Cuban style of salsa. And Cuba is the home or the origination of salsa. The music from Cuba, or the dance styles from Cuba, come originally from Africa, from the slaves who brought percussion and the vigorous body movements. And the Spaniards brought melody And they brought partner dancing, where you actually face your partner, which doesn't happen in African music. And also there were Western influences. Jazz, for example, influenced Cuban music and introduced brass into their bands. And rock and roll introduced dancing on the first beat of the bar. So Cuban music is a synthesis of all these different styles. So I went to Cuba, and on this tour we went to 3 major cities in Cuba, including Havana, Trinidad, and Santiago de Cuba. The third city was Santiago, where we had a week, and each morning we'd have 2 hours of classes. The first hour would be a Cuban dance style, and the second hour would be son, that's S-O-N. Son is an earlier or a precursor to salsa. It's a little bit more elegant. The music is a bit slower, and it's a different style to salsa. And I really wanted to learn son, and so I was very excited to spend a week learning son. But the other thing I'd had in my mind before going to Cuba was I just really love watching these video clips of a couple dancing with the colonial buildings in the background and in the square, or maybe with a harbour backdrop or the seawall in Havana. And I thought I'd just really like to recreate that myself. So at the Sandanga Dance School, each morning we'd have 2 hours of classes. The first hour would be a Cuban dance style, and the second hour we'd do son. And that was the duet that I really wanted to do. So I was able to dance with our main dance teacher, and we went to this beautiful location in Santiago. So each morning we'd walk to the dance school through the streets of Santiago, go upstairs. The dance floor was actually on the 3rd floor, and each morning we'd have a different warm-up. One of the teachers would lead the warm-up. I really wanted to get to this duet, so after the 2-hour class, I stayed back and did an individual class with the main teacher. And at the end of that week, towards the end of that week, and I was still trying to remember all the dance patterns, we located a lovely colonial courtyard with the harbour in the background, and sort of late one afternoon or early evening we shot this footage doing this traditional song. It was a bit like Dancing with the Stars, but without a star. And there I was, wearing my Cuban special shirt and my dance shoes, and I'd made it. I did it. Just to backtrack now, about 3 or 4 years ago, I realized that something had changed in me from all the distress and trauma and the brain injury and getting through that immense struggle. Something had changed in me that actually was a good thing. It was like I was a better version of the person I'd been before. It's not like I would choose to go through that suffering again or that struggle, but I really liked the person I had become. Suffering had changed me, and I learned there was a field of research called post-traumatic growth. I thought, why not write a book about that? How people are actually changed in positive ways through suffering, particularly from the type of suffering that comes from major life crises. So once I became very clear about what I wanted to do, which was to speak with and get to know others that have been through a range of different major life crises, I started on this 3-year project, and the result was my most recent book, published early this year, The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises. And some of the people that feature in this book truly inspired me, and honestly I fell in love with everybody. I also looked at why some people stay stuck in their suffering, because that's probably just as important as how people grow. Morris Gleason, for example, was 12 years old when he was blinded as a child in the school yard, and that was just the start of his traumas. Ian Roberts, the famous rugby league footballer, held 2 secrets. One, that he was gay when he was a professional footballer, But also another surprising secret, which you'll just have to find out if you read the book. Sandra Bond, who had a stillbirth child when everything seemed perfectly fine, and other stories in here. And I really wanted to draw on lived experience, not just on the academic research in the field of post-traumatic growth. So that's my talk today about the twists and turns of life and the surprising opportunities they present. I've enjoyed speaking with you. I hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you.